Chapter 17 Battle at Broken Fields. Rakan's heart warmed as he emerged from the trees to see his 3 sons coming to greet him from the war camp. It was a strange, bittersweet thing to see them dressed ready for war. He felt at once proud of the men they were now and terrified of what they would soon face on the battlefield. "Father," Rashan said as the 3 brothers fell into step beside Rakan. They didn't dare stop to greet each other, lest they be trampled by the army of Magi that marched just behind Rakan. Rashan was the eldest of his sons, who recently celebrated his 34th year. "Rashan, Talion, Edarin, so good to see you boys. How are preparations coming along?" "Smoothly," Talion said. "We're hardly a stone's throw away from home. We've been set up here for a while now, waiting for the other armies and keeping a weathered eye on the mountains." Rakan looked out across the fields and marveled at the carefully organized rows of tents. Even this far from the edge of camp, he could see the centermost tent, standing twice as tall as the others. Their nation's flag, a blue banner with a strong tower upon it, flapped in the wind at each of the 4 corners of the great tent. There was no doubt that it was the king's tent, and was likely where the man was now planning their formations for attack. Between the rows of the hundreds of other tents, the encampment bustled with activity. Soldiers scurried about from place to place, sending messages, running drills, preparing themselves for war. It had been years since they last marched, but even in times of peace, the armies of men practiced the art. They were surrounded by noise as they drew nearer to the camp. The bustling of the army before them was matched by the rhythmic marching of the one behind. Even in all the noise, Rakan could still hear the screeching of the wheels that bore upon them the scores of weapons they had spent so much time enchanting. So much trouble for the existence of one particular enemy. Lier Conan called for a halt, and the entire army of Magi obeyed in near unison. Rakan waved for his sons to continue. He was not bound by the demands of the Lier outside of her province, and he was eager to be among his people again. He and his sons weaved their way between the tents of camp, chattering idly about what Rakan had missed while he was away. He inquired after their wives and children, eager to hear news of his family. He had missed this while he was away, the company of his sons. He realized that he even missed the bustle of a busy street. Yet, when he was in the thick of danger and trouble, he had hardly thought of them. There was still a part of him that leaped wholeheartedly into adventure and didn't look back. They reached the other end of camp just as the sun was meeting the edge of the horizon. Rakan peered out across the empty fields toward where he knew the fortress lay between the mountains. There was no sign of motion at all. What are they waiting for? He wondered. They had plenty of opportunity to form their armies and attack before the other races had prepared for war. Rakan's heart grew heavy with a strange sense of foreboding. There's something going on that we don't know about. "First snow, father," Edarin said. Sure enough, flakes of snow drifted down from the sky before his eyes. He looked for a moment on his 3 sons as he took a deep breath. Staring back towards the fortress, he steeled himself. The time was drawing near that even if the armies of Desh did not march out, the peoples of Cosmea would come to them. War was upon them, hanging heavy in the air. "On your feet, soldier!" Uruk groaned as he opened his eyes. Standing at the door of his tent was Kiran, already dressed in her leather armor, hands on her hips and a smirk on her face. "She enjoys torturing me," he thought, as he got to his feet and reached for his things. Not long after they had reached Talmeir, Kiran had come to him one night and offered to train him. He had been incredulous at first, insulted that she would offer him something he had already received not long after his birth. She challenged him to fight her, and if he could win, she had nothing to teach him. He had lost. "You fight like a woodcutter chopping at a tree," she had said. "You hack at something with all your strength and hope it breaks. I can teach you a better way." So every morning, as soon as the sun's first light broke the dark, she was at his doorway, goading him to spar with her. Even on the road to Broken Fields, she had woken him before the others and sparred with him until they were on the march. Now that they had been at this infernal camp for weeks, she still would not relent. Urg finished clasping on his armor and picked up his sword, marveling at the strange green letters marked on its surface. It seemed odd to him how men, magi, and dwellers made their instruments of war so pretty. It seemed to Urg such a waste to put effort into shining something that would only sow death and destruction. Yet the words on the sword were in his tongue. The choice of phrase seemed strange for their intended purpose. "Come now, scarred one. You gonna stare at your shiny blade all day, or come show me what you got on the sparring field?" The half-Desh frowned. Kiran seemed to take every opportunity presented to try and get under his skin. He put on his sword and turned to face her, giving her the best look of defiance that he could muster. "Bring it on." The two walked together in silence to the sparring field near the southern part of the camp. Already soldiers were stirring from sleep and facing the day. Urg had soon learned that these people scrambled for all the time they could get out of the day. Among the Daesh there was no early rising or morning training. Kiran had told them that they referred to the practice as discipline. When they reached the field, the two faced each other at 6 feet apart and drew their weapons. Kiran drew both of her swords and took a wide stance, holding her blades out to the side. This stance left a glaring opening at her chest, a flaw that Urg had once chided her for. The opening was intentional, a ploy to tempt an opponent into attacking. Urg had been trained to attack first, fast and hard. The way of the Daesh was the way of overpowering. Destroy your opponents before they could mount a defense, or at least wear him down for the next of your army to drop him. Kiran fought in a much different way, even from her human peers. She was trained by the Magi. Kiran fought like a snake, always moving about, lashing out and retreating, picking apart her enemy one bit at a time. For a moment they circled each other, sizing each other up and waiting for someone to strike first. It was always Urg. Kiran always waited for him to lose his patience and strike. It was no different this morning. Urg leapt forward, feigning to strike her chest, only to swing his blade around and come to her low left. She anticipated this and deflected his blow. He had tried this trick before. With Kiran, the nature of fighting was different. She had taken what had once been a contest of strength and dominance and turned it into this strange game of guessing. It hurt Urg's mind, trying to anticipate what she was going to do before she did it, trying to throw her off with feigned moves, only to have her guess what he was feigning. It was maddening. For hours they continued trading blows back and forth until finally Urg made a miscalculation and she caught him off guard, knocking him to his back. Anger welled up in him as he collided with the ground. So many mornings, and he had yet to defeat her once. He looked up and saw her offering her hand to him. He took it and at once forgot his frustration. Mureth sat in the corner of her dark tent, holding her knees to her chest and staring down at the dirt floor. Everywhere around her there were sounds of people moving about. She had no idea what sorts of things kept soldiers busy as they prepared for war. She hated that the camp was never quiet, though she doubted she could sleep anyway. The nightmares had come back with force. They were different now, no longer centered around her mother and father. Every night now the dream was the same. Adamir stood before her, holding out his hand to take it. Sometimes she took it gladly, other times she turned to run. No matter what her choice, the result was the same. Adamir twisted and changed, growing into a ferocious beast that sought to devour her. Sometimes the others were there, standing and watching in silence, making no move to help or hinder her. Mureth closed her eyes and clenched her fist. She refused to be a victim to her fears and doubts. She was in control, and she would see to it that Adamir would hurt no one. All she needed was a hint of betrayal to give her the necessary doubt in his comrades. Then she would end him. Anxiety began to gnaw at Rakan's stomach as he stared in wonder at the empty tent in front of him. Just moments ago, he had been called from the front lines back to camp, and Lycian was nowhere to be seen. He bent low and inspected the ground with well-trained eyes for a sign of a struggle. Something felt oddly familiar about this situation. What happened? Belethor asked from behind him. Where did the wizard go? There's no sign of a fight here, which makes sense considering someone would have heard if there were. I can see tracks where Lycian was dragged away from the tent by his shoulders, but I don't see corresponding tracks for his assailant. How strange. Reminds me of when the blind prisoner disappeared. This is practically the same. You're right, but there's one key difference. Before there were no tracks at all, but here there are clear tracks left by Lycian. Though strange, it works to our advantage. This time we have a lead to follow. Call together our old team. We're going to need specialists for this kind of work. They're wasted on the battlefield anyway. Belethor saluted and hurried off to find the others. Rakan remained for a moment, simply staring at the strange tracks before him. Foreboding continued to grow in his heart. There was so much going on that he didn't understand. Why did the Daesh wait so long to march? How are these people vanishing? There were few things Rakan hated more than charging to war, not knowing all he needed to know. He stood to his feet and turned to the door. He knew enough to know what he needed to do next. That would have to be enough. Urg shifted uncomfortably in his wooden chair, fighting back the welling frustration within him. He tightened the straps on his armor as he waited impatiently in his tent. They had forbidden him from entering the battlefield. He tried hard to convince himself that they were only being careful, and yet old feelings of anger were slowly boiling to his surface. He stood suddenly to his feet and began to pace. His blood itched for war, as it had his entire life. Knowing that so close by, armies would be clashing, blood would be spilled, burned in his stomach. He drew his sword and began to run through the drills that Kiran had taught him. He poured his burning anger into every slice of his blade through the air. He twisted and turned. He parried his invisible foe. He stopped suddenly, slamming his sword back into its sheath. That's it, he thought. I don't care what they say. Holding his chin high, he turned with a flourish and marched proudly to the entrance of his tent and flung open the straps. Just as he did, he started with surprise to see Bellathor standing there, reaching for the tent flap that was no longer there. Anger flared in Uruk. Now they're sending someone to watch over me. He stepped out as Bellathor took a step back, just recovering from the surprise timing. Uruk, Bellathor said with a barbed tone, Rakan has sent for you. Elysian has gone missing, and he wants a team to come together to find him. For a moment, Uruk was silent in shock at what he heard. Then a smile spread across his face. Let's go. Trumpets blared in the distance, and Rakan watched longingly as the united armies began to march forward in formation toward the mountains. He thought of his sons and quickly lifted a silent prayer to Thessa for their well-being. He fought back the temptation to run to join them as he tapped his feet impatiently. Around Rakan his teammates stood, clearly sharing his anxiety. The dawn of battle awoke the passions of all warriors, and leaving the battlefield had been hard for all of them, save perhaps Adamir. The Magi was far too excited by the mystery of it all to be much concerned for the warfare that would take place without them. Rakan had followed the trail to the edge of the camp, then waited as slowly one by one his comrades joined him there. He could see the trail headed into the nearby forest. Every moment that passed by waiting added stress to Rakan's shoulders. Elysium was far too important to abandon him even to the call of war, but too powerful to be taken easily. Rakan would need all of his teammates to be sure they would handle whatever was in store for them. Soon Bellathor and Uruk approached quickly, a sour look across the nobleman's face. He hadn't sent for Uruk before. Rakan had sent him back for him when they had all arrived. He had worried for a moment that Bellathor would strike him for asking. We have no time to waste, Rakan said. We move quickly, weapons drawn. We have not the luxury of time for stealthy movement. We will hope to overpower whoever has taken Elysian. Let's go. He turned, drawing his sword and running for the trees. He did not wait to see if the others were following. Though at times they bickered amongst themselves, he knew them well enough to know that they would not hesitate when the time came for action. Soon they were surrounded by trees, and the army camp faded behind them. Still, Rakan could hear the steady footfalls of the armored soldiers stepping forward in rhythm. He kept his eyes on the ground before him, his careful eye seeing the disturbed leaves that were left in the wake of Elysian's kidnapping. A horrid burnt smell met Rakan's nose as he emerged into a clearing in the trees. No, not a clearing, he realized, as he saw the scorched fallen trees before him. He could almost feel the power of magic in the air, though he wondered if it was all in his head. He scanned the carnage before him and saw a body face down between two fallen trees. He rushed over to it. The others quickly came to his side as he knelt down and grasped the fallen man by his shoulder. He could smell that awful burning smell much more clearly here. He turned the body over to see that it was not Elysian after all. It took him a moment to recognize Sakana laying before him. His strange white cloak was burned at his side, revealing charred flesh to match the hideous scar on his face. Lornar leaned down and placed her hands on the blind man's side as she chanted healing spells. A faint glow emanated from the palms of her hands as the healing magic began to do its work. Rakan stood to his feet and pushed his comrades crowded around him aside. He walked slowly around the fallen trees, but saw no sign of Elysian. The wizard! Rakan twirled around to see the blind man suddenly upright, his hand reaching out toward him. His empty eye sockets were open wide, staring into Rakan's soul. Lornar tried to coax him back into a lying position, but he pushed against her. You have to stop the wizard. He will doom us all. He is not what he seems. What happened, Sakana? Rakan asked forcefully. Did you kidnap Elysian? What did you hope to achieve? Drop your weapons. They are his weapons, not yours. Every blade must hit the ground, now. You're not making sense, Sakana. Why did you attack Elysian? Where has he gone now? Drop your weapons and flee now. It is too late to stop him, but you can at least live if you listen to me. Rakan looked down at the sword in his hand, then back at the flailing blind man. Where was this coming from? How had he managed to kidnap the wizard from the midst of their camp without alerting anyone? So many questions flooded his mind as his pulse rate quickened. Tie him up and carry him with us. This forest runs parallel to the fields. If we hurry, we can reach the front lines before the two armies meet. Quickly! Without hesitation, Nolendil pulled a rope from his pack and laced it around the frantic man's hands and feet while several of the others held him still. He continued to struggle and thrash, wailing loudly. You'll doom yourselves! Listen to me! Drop your weapons! It's your only hope! As soon as Nolendil finished tying the man and began to lift him, Rakan took off running through the trees. He heard the others running behind him, the Magi among them easily keeping pace. Fear grew within Rakan the closer he got to the edge of the forest. When he saw the marching soldiers, he turned and ran alongside them, staying behind the tree line. He can't be right, Rakan thought as he ran. He's clearly insane. His words mean nothing. The soldiers to his right stopped marching. They were within range of the Desh now. He heard a voice calling out to the Desh, probably Erigil giving them a chance to surrender. Rakan came to a halt as he passed by the soldiers at the front lines. His lungs burned and he wheezed for breath. He looked out at the Desh who stood in formation. They did not draw any weapons. Something was horribly wrong. Suddenly the front lines of the Desh parted and a figure emerged clad in deep black armor. The dark of the armor seemed unnatural. It reminded Rakan immediately of the strange wall of the fortress of Malsheth. Upon the breast of his armor was a familiar sigil of two semicircles joined by a staff. In his right hand the figure held aloft a wooden staff. It was Enlysian. Enlysian? King Erigil called out. You have betrayed us! Murmurs of surprise came from the united armies when they recognized the Magi standing before them. A sinister smile spread across Enlysian's face as he remained silent at the accusation. Rakan tore his sword from his belt and threw it to the ground before him. He opened his mouth to cry out, but it was too late. The wizard raised his staff as it emitted a shining green light. Throw your weapons down! Rakan yelled to his companions. He turned to look back at them, and they stared at him with surprised looks before throwing their own weapons to the ground. Cries of anguish resounded from behind Rakan as tears formed at the corners of his eyes. We have to go, he said quietly. No one moved. Rakan himself stood still, unable to tear himself from where he stood. We have to go. He turned back and looked at the united army. Enlysian laughed as he pointed his staff to the ground. As one, the entire army of men, Magi, and Dweller bent down to one knee, bowing before their new master. Among the crowd, Rakan could clearly make out his own three sons bowing to the wizard. Despair flooded his heart. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below if you saw this twist coming. Until next time.